Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of My Disillusionment in Russia by Emma Goldman. Chapter 10, The British Labor Mission.
I was glad to learn that Angelika Balabanova arrived in Petrograd to prepare quarters for the British Labor Mission. During my stay in Moscow, I had come to know and appreciate the fine spirit of Angelika. She was very devoted to me, and when I fell ill, she gave much time to my care, procured medicine which could be obtained only in the Kremlin drugstore, and got special sick rations for me. Her friendship was generous and touching, and she endeared herself very much to me. The Narishkin Palace was to be prepared for the mission, and Angelika invited me to accompany her there. I noticed that she looked more worn and distressed than when I had seen her in Moscow. Our conversation made it clear to me that she suffered keenly from the reality which was so unlike her ideal, but she insisted that what seemed failure to me was conditioned in life itself the greatest failure. Narishkin Palace is situated on the southern bank of the Neva, almost opposite the Peter and Paul fortress. The place was prepared for the expected guests, and a number of servants and cooks installed to minister to their needs. Soon the mission arrived, most of them typical workingmen delegates, and with them a staff of newspaper men and Mrs. Snowdon. The most outstanding figure among them was Bertrand Russell, who quickly demonstrated his independence and determination to be free to investigate and learn at first hand. In honor of the mission, the Bolsheviki organized a great demonstration on the Uritsky Square. Thousands of people, among them women and children, came to show their gratitude to the English labor representatives for venturing into revolutionary Russia. The ceremony consisted of the singing of the Internationale, followed by music and speeches, the latter translated by Balabanova in masterly fashion. Then came the military exercises. I heard Mrs. Snowdon say disapprovingly, "What a display of military!" I could not resist the temptation of remarking, "Madame, remember that the big Russian army is largely the making of your own country. Had England not helped to finance the invasions into Russia, the latter could put its soldiers to useful labor." The British mission was entertained royally with theaters, operas, ballets, and excursions. Luxury was heaped upon them while the people slaved and went hungry. The Soviet government left nothing undone to create a good impression, and everything of a disturbing nature was kept from the visitors. Angelika hated the display and sham and suffered keenly under the rigid watch placed upon every movement of the mission. Why should they not see the true state of Russia? Why should they not learn how the Russian people live? She would lament. Yet I am so impractical, she would correct herself. Perhaps it is all necessary. At the end of 2 weeks, a farewell banquet was given to the visitors. Angelika insisted that I must attend. Again, there were speeches and toasts, as is the custom at such functions. The speeches which seemed to ring most sincere were those of Balabanova and Madame Ravitch. The latter asked me to interpret her address, which I did. She spoke in behalf of the Russian women proletarians and praised their fortitude and devotion to the revolution. May the English proletarians learn the quality of their heroic Russian sisters, concluded Madame Ravitch. Mrs. Snowdon, the erstwhile suffragette, had not a word in reply. She preserved a dignified aloofness. However, the lady became enlivened when the speeches were over and she got busy collecting autographs.
Chapter 11, A Visit from the Ukraine.
Early in May, 2 young men from the Ukraine arrived in Petrograd. Both had lived in America for a number of years and had been active in the Yiddish labor and anarchist movements. One of them had also been editor of an English weekly anarchist paper, The Alarm, published in Chicago. In 1917, at the outbreak of the revolution, they left for Russia together with other emigrants. Arriving in their native country, they joined the anarchist activities there, which had gained tremendous impetus through the revolution. Their main field was the Ukraine. In 1918, they aided in the organization of the anarchist federation Nab Alarm and began the publication of a paper by that name. Theoretically, they were at variance with the Bolsheviki, practically the Federation anarchists, even as the anarchists throughout Russia worked with the Bolsheviki and also fought on every front against the counter-revolutionary forces. When the two Ukrainian comrades learned of our arrival in Russia, they repeatedly tried to reach us, but owing to the political conditions and the practical impossibility of traveling, they could not come north. Subsequently, they had been arrested and imprisoned by the Bolsheviki. Immediately upon their release, they started for Petrograd, traveling illegally. They knew the dangers confronting them, arrest and possible shooting for the possession and use of false documents. But they were willing to risk anything because they were determined that we should learn the facts about the povstanci, revolutionary peasants, movements led by that extraordinary figure, Nestor Makhno. They wanted to acquaint us with the history of the anarchist activities in Russia and relate how the iron hand of the Bolsheviki had crushed them. During 2 weeks in the stillness of the Petrograd nights, the two Ukrainian anarchists unrolled before us the panorama of the struggle in the Ukraine. Dispassionately, quietly, and with almost uncanny detachment, the young men told their story. 13 different governments had ruled Ukraine. Each of them had robbed and murdered the peasantry, made ghastly pogroms, and left death and ruin in its way. The Ukrainian peasants, a more independent and spirited race than their northern brothers, had come to hate all governments and every measure which threatened their land and freedom. They banded together and fought back their oppressors all through the long years of the revolutionary period. The peasants had no theories. They could not be classed in any political party. Theirs was an instinctive hatred of tyranny, and practically the whole of Ukraine soon became a rebel camp. Into this seething cauldron there came in 1917 Nestor Makhno. Makhno was a Ukrainian-born. A natural rebel, he became interested in anarchism at an early age. At 17, he attempted the life of a Tsarist spy and was sentenced to death, but owing to his extreme youth, the sentence was commuted to katorga for life, severe imprisonment, 1/3 of the term in chains. The February Revolution opened the prison doors for all political prisoners, Makhno among them. He had then spent 10 years in the Butyrki prison in Moscow. He had but a limited schooling when first arrested, but in prison he had used his leisure to good advantage. By the time of his release, he had acquired considerable knowledge of history, political economy, and literature. Shortly after his liberation, Makhno returned to his native village, Guliai Pole, where he organized a trade union and the local Soviet. Then he threw himself in the revolutionary movement, and during all of 1917, he was the spiritual teacher and leader of the rebel peasants who had risen against the landed proprietors. In 1918, when the Brest Peace opened Ukraine to German and Austrian occupation, Makhno organized the rebel peasant bands in defense against the foreign armies. He fought against Skoropadsky, the Ukrainian hetman, who was supported by German bayonets. He waged successful guerrilla warfare against Petlura, Kaledin, Grigoriev, and Denikin. A conscious anarchist, he labored to give the instinctive rebellion of the peasantry definite aim and purpose. It was the Makhno idea that the social revolution was to be defended against all enemies, against every counter-revolutionary or reactionary attempt from right and left. At the same time, educational and cultural work was carried on among the peasants to develop them along anarchist communist lines, with the aim of establishing free peasant communes. In February 1919, Makhno entered into an agreement with the Red Army. He was to continue to hold the southern front against Denikin and to receive from the Bolsheviki the necessary arms and ammunition. Makhno was to remain in charge of the povstanci, now grown into an army, the latter to have autonomy in its local organizations, the revolutionary Soviets of the district, which covered several provinces. It was agreed that the povstanci should have the right to hold conferences, freely discuss their affairs, and take action upon them. 3 such conferences were held in February, March, and April. But the Bolsheviki failed to live up to the agreement. The supplies which had been promised Makhno, and which he needed desperately, would arrive after long delays or failed to come altogether. It was charged that this situation was due to the orders of Trotsky, who did not look favorably upon the independent rebel army. However it be, Makhno was hampered at every step, while Denikin was gaining ground constantly. Presently the Bolsheviki began to object to the Free Peasant Soviets, and in May 1919, the commander-in-chief of the Southern Armies, Kamenev, accompanied by members of the Kharkov government, arrived at the Makhno headquarters to settle the disputed matters. In the end, the Bolshevik military representatives demanded that the Povstanci dissolve. The latter refused, charging the Bolsheviki with a breach of their revolutionary agreement. Meanwhile, the Denikin advance was becoming more threatening, and Makhno still received no support from the Bolsheviki. The peasant army then decided to call a special session of the Soviet for June 15th. Definite plans and methods were to be decided upon to check the growing menace of Denikin. But on June 4th, Trotsky issued an order prohibiting the holding of the conference and declaring Makhno an outlaw. In a public meeting in Kharkov, Trotsky announced that it were better to permit the whites to remain in the Ukraina than to suffer Makhno. The presence of the whites, he said, would influence the Ukrainian peasantry in favor of the Soviet government, whereas Makhno and his Povstanci would never make peace with the Bolsheviki. They would attempt to possess themselves of some territory and to practice their ideas, which would be a constant menace to the communist government. It was practically a declaration of war against Makhno and his army. Soon the latter found itself attacked on two sides at once by the Bolsheviki and Denikin. The Povstanci were poorly equipped and lacked the most necessary supplies for warfare. Yet the peasant army for a considerable time succeeded in holding its own by the sheer military genius of its leader and the reckless courage of his devoted rebels. At the same time, the Bolsheviki began a campaign of denunciation against Makhno and his Povstanci. The communist press accused him of having treacherously opened the southern front to Denikin, and branded Makhno's army a bandit gang and its leader a counter-revolutionist who must be destroyed at all cost. But this counter-revolutionist fully realized the Denikin menace to the revolution. He gathered new forces and support among the peasants, and in the months of September and October 1919, his campaign against Denikin gave the latter its death blow on the Ukraina. Makhno captured Denikin's artillery base at Mariupol, annihilated the rear of the enemy's army, and succeeded in separating the main body from its base of supply. This brilliant maneuver of Makhno and the heroic fighting of the rebel army again brought about friendly contact with the Bolsheviki. The ban was lifted from the Povstanci, and the communist press now began to eulogize Makhno as a great military genius and brave defender of the revolution in the Ukraina. But the differences between Makhno and the Bolsheviki were deep-rooted. He strove to establish free peasant communes in the Ukraina, while the communists were bent on imposing the Moscow rule. Ultimately, a clash was inevitable, and it came early in January 1920. At that period, a new enemy was threatening the revolution. Grigoriev, formerly of the Tsarist army, later friend of the Bolsheviki, now turned against them. Having gained considerable support in the South because of his slogans of freedom and free Soviets, Grigoriev proposed to Makhno that they join forces against the communist regime. Makhno called a meeting of the two armies and there publicly accused Grigoriev of counter-revolution and produced evidence of numerous pogroms organized by him against the Jews. Declaring Grigoriev an enemy of the people and of the revolution, Makhno and his staff condemned him and his aides to death, executing them on the spot. Part of Grigoriev's army joined Makhno. Meanwhile, Denikin kept pressing Makhno, finally forcing him to withdraw from his position. Not, of course, without bitter fighting all along the line of 900 versts, the retreat lasting 4 months, Makhno marching toward Galicia. Denikin advanced upon Kharkov, then farther north, capturing Orel and Kursk, and finally reached the gates of Tula, in the immediate neighborhood of Moscow. The Red Army seemed powerless to check the advance of Denikin, but meanwhile, Makhno had gathered new forces and attacked Denikin in the rear. The unexpectedness of this new turn and the extraordinary military exploits of Makhno's men in this campaign disorganized the plans of Denikin, demoralized his army, and gave the Red Army the opportunity of taking the offensive against the counter-revolutionary enemy in the neighborhood of Tula. When the Red Army reached Alexandrovsk after having finally beaten the Denikin forces, Trotsky again demanded of Makhno that he disarm his men and place himself under the discipline of the Red Army. The Povstanci refused, whereupon an organized military campaign against the rebels was inaugurated, the Bolsheviki taking many prisoners and killing scores of others. Makhno, who managed to escape the Bolshevik net, was again declared an outlaw and bandit. Since then, Makhno had been uninterruptedly waging guerrilla warfare against the Bolshevik regime. The story of the Ukrainian friends, which I have related here in very condensed form, sounded as romantic as the exploits of Stenka Rasin, the famous Cossack rebel immortalized by Gogol. Romantic and picturesque, but what bearing did the activities of Makhno and his men have upon anarchism? I questioned the two comrades. Makhno, my informants explained, was himself an anarchist seeking to free Ukraine from all oppression and striving to develop and organize the peasants' latent anarchistic tendencies. To this end, Makhno had repeatedly called upon the anarchists of the Ukraine and of Russia to aid him. He offered them the widest opportunity for propagandistic and educational work, supplied them with printing outfits and meeting places, and gave them the fullest liberty of action. Whenever Makhno captured a city, freedom of speech and press for anarchists and left social revolutionists was established. Makhno often said, "I am a military man and I have no time for educational work, but you who are writers and speakers, you can do that work. Join me and together we shall be able to prepare the field for a real anarchist experiment." But the chief value of the Makhno movement lay in the peasants themselves, my comrades thought. It was a spontaneous, elemental movement, the peasants' opposition to all governments being the result not of theories, but of bitter experience and of instinctive love of liberty. They were fertile ground for anarchist ideas. For this reason, a number of anarchists joined Makhno. They were with him in most of his military campaigns and energetically carried on anarchist propaganda during that time. I have been told by Zorin and other communists that Makhno was a Jew baiter and that his povstanci were responsible for numerous brutal pogroms. My visitors emphatically denied the charges. Makhno bitterly fought pogroms, they stated. He had often issued proclamations against such outrages, and he had even with his own hand punished some of those guilty of assault on Jews. Hatred of the Hebrew was of course common in the Ukraine. It was not eradicated even among the Red soldiers. They too have assaulted, robbed, and outraged Jews. Yet no one holds the Bolsheviki responsible for such isolated instances. The Ukraine is infested with armed bands who are often mistaken for Makhnovchi and who have made pogroms. The Bolsheviki, aware of this, have exploited the confusion to discredit Makhno and his followers. However, the anarchist of the Ukraine, I was informed, did not idealize the Makhno movement. They knew that the povstanci were not conscious anarchists. Their paper Nabat had repeatedly emphasized this fact. On the other hand, the anarchists could not overlook the importance of popular movement which was instinctively rebellious, anarchistically inclined, and successful in driving back the enemies of the revolution, which the better organized and equipped Bolshevik army could not accomplish. For this reason, many anarchists considered it their duty to work with Makhno, but the bulk remained away. They had their larger cultural, educational, and organizing work to do. The invading counter-revolutionary forces, though differing in character and purpose, all agreed in their relentless persecution of the anarchists. The latter were made to suffer, whatever the new regime. The Bolsheviki were no better in this regard than Denikin or any other white element. Anarchists filled Bolshevik prisons. Many had been shot, and all legal anarchist activities were suppressed. The Cheka especially was doing ghastly work, having resurrected the old Tsarist methods, including even torture. My young visitors spoke from experience. They had repeatedly been in Bolshevik prisons themselves.
Chapter 12, Beneath the Surface.
The terrible story I had been listening to for 2 weeks broke over me like a storm. Was this the revolution I had believed in all my life, yearned for, and strove to interest others in, or was it a caricature, a hideous monster that had come to jeer and mock me? The communists I had met daily during 6 months, self-sacrificing, hard-working men and women imbued with a high ideal, were such people capable of the treachery and horrors charged against them? Zinoviev, Radek, Zorin, Ravich, and many others I had learned to know, could they, in the name of an ideal lie, defame, torture, kill? But then, had not Zorin told me that capital punishment had been abolished in Russia? Yet I learned shortly after my arrival that hundreds of people had been shot on the very eve of the day when the new decree went into effect, and that as a matter of fact, shooting by the Cheka had never ceased. That, my friends were not exaggerating when they spoke of tortures by the Cheka, I also learned from other sources. Complaints about the fearful conditions in Petrograd prisons had become so numerous that Moscow was apprised of the situation. A Cheka inspector came to investigate. The prisoners being afraid to speak, immunity was promised them. But no sooner had the inspector left than one of the inmates, a young boy who had been very outspoken about the brutalities practiced by the Cheka, was dragged out of his cell and cruelly beaten. Why did Zorin resort to lies? Surely he must have known that I would not remain in the dark very long. And then, was not Lenin also guilty of the same methods? Anarchists of ideas are not in our prisons, he had assured me. Yet at that very moment, numerous anarchists filled the jails of Moscow and Petrograd and of many other cities in Russia. In May 1920, scores of them had been arrested in Petrograd, among them 2 girls of 17 and 19 years of age. None of the prisoners were charged with counter-revolutionary activities. They were anarchists of ideas, to use Lenin's expression. Several of them had issued a manifesto for the 1st of May, calling attention to the appalling conditions in the factories of the Socialist Republic. The 2 young girls who had circulated a handbill against the Labor Book, which had then just gone into effect, were also arrested. The Labor Book was heralded by the Bolsheviki as one of the great communist achievements. It would establish equality and abolish parasitism, it was claimed. As a matter of fact, the Labor Book was somewhat of the character of the yellow ticket issued to prostitutes under the Tsarist regime. It was a record of every step one made, and without it, no step could be made. It bound its holder to his job, to the city he lived in, and to the room he occupied. It recorded one's political faith and party adherence, and the number of times he was arrested. In short, a yellow ticket. Even some communists resented the degrading innovation. The anarchists who protested against it were arrested by the Cheka. When certain leading communists were approached in the matter, they repeated what Lenin had said, "No anarchists of ideas are in our prisons." The aureole was falling from the communists. All of them seemed to believe that the end justified the means. I recalled the statements of Radek at the first anniversary of the Third International, when he related to his audience the marvelous spread of communism in America. 50,000 communists are in American prisons, he exclaimed. Molly Steimer, a girl of 18, and her male companions, all communists, had been deported from America for their communist activities. I thought at the time that Radek was misinformed, yet it seemed strange that he did not make sure of his facts before making such assertions. They were dishonest, and an insult to Molly Steimer and her anarchist comrades, added to the injustice they had suffered at the hands of the American plutocracy. During the past several months, I had seen and heard enough to become somewhat conversant with the communist psychology, as well as with the theories and methods of the Bolsheviki. I was no longer surprised at the story of their double dealing with Makhno, the brutalities practiced by the Cheka, the lies of Zorin. I had come to realize that the communists believed implicitly in the Jesuitic formula that the end justifies all means. In fact, they gloried in that formula. Any suggestion of the value of human life, quality of character, the importance of revolutionary integrity as the basis of a new social order was repudiated as bourgeois sentimentality, which had no place in the revolutionary scheme of things. For the Bolsheviki, the end to be achieved was the communist state, or the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat. Everything which advanced that end was justifiable and revolutionary. The Lenins, Radeks, and Zorins were therefore quite consistent. Obsessed by the infallibility of their creed, giving of themselves to the fullest, they could be both heroic and despicable at the same time. They could work 20 hours a day, live on herring and tea, and order the slaughter of innocent men and women. Occasionally, they sought to mask their killings by pretending a misunderstanding, for doesn't the end justify all means? They could employ torture and deny the Inquisition. They could lie and defame and call themselves idealists. In short, they could make themselves and others believe that everything was legitimate and right from the revolutionary viewpoint. Any other policy was weak, sentimental, or a betrayal of the revolution. On a certain occasion, when I passed criticism on the brutal way delicate women were driven into the streets to shovel snow, insisting that even if they had belonged to the bourgeoisie, they were human, and that physical fitness should be taken into consideration, a communist said to me, "You should be ashamed of yourself. You, an old revolutionist, and yet so sentimental." It was the same attitude that some communists assumed toward Angelika Balabanova, because she was always solicitous and eager to help wherever possible. In short, I had come to see that the Bolsheviki were social Puritans who sincerely believed that they alone were ordained to save mankind. My relations with the Bolsheviki became more strained, my attitude toward the revolution as I found it more critical. One thing grew quite clear to me. I could not affiliate myself with the Soviet government. I could not accept any work which would place me under the control of the communist machine. The Commissariat of Education was so thoroughly dominated by that machine that it was hopeless to expect anything but routine work. In fact, unless one was a communist, one could accomplish almost nothing. I had been eager to join Lunacharsky, whom I considered one of the most cultivated and least dogmatic of the communists in high position. But I became convinced that Lunacharsky himself was a helpless cog in the machine, his best efforts constantly curtailed and checked. I had also learned a great deal about the system of favoritism and graft that prevailed in the management of the schools and the treatment of children. Some schools were in splendid condition, the children well-fed and well-clad, enjoying concerts, theatricals, dances, and other amusements. But the majority of the schools and children's homes were squalid, dirty, and neglected. Those in charge of the preferred schools had little difficulty in procuring everything needed for their charges, often having an oversupply. But the caretakers of the common schools would waste their time and energies by the week going about from one department to another, discouraged and faint with endless waiting before they could obtain the merest necessities. At first, I ascribed this condition of affairs to the scarcity of food and materials. I heard it said often enough that the blockade and intervention were responsible. To a large extent, that was true. Had Russia not been so starved, mismanagement and graft would not have had such fatal results. But added to the prevalent scarcity of things was the dominant notion of communist propaganda. Even the children had to serve that end. The well-kept schools were for show, for the foreign missions and delegates who were visiting Russia. Everything was lavished on these show schools at the cost of the others. I remembered how everybody was startled in Petrograd by an article in the Petrograd Pravda of May, disclosing appalling conditions in the schools. A committee of the young communist organizations investigated some of the institutions. They found the children dirty, full of vermin, sleeping on filthy mattresses, fed on miserable food, punished by being locked in dark rooms for the night, forced to go without their suppers, and even beaten. The number of officials and employees in the schools was nothing less than criminal. In one school, for instance, there were 138 of them to 125 children. In another, 40 to 25 children. All these parasites were taking the bread from the very mouths of the unfortunate children. The Zorins had spoken to me repeatedly of Lelina, the woman in charge of the Petrograd Educational Department. She was a wonderful worker, they said, devoted and able. I had heard her speak on several occasions, but was not impressed. She looked prim and self-satisfied, a typical Puritan schoolma'am, but I would not form an opinion until I had talked with her. At the publication of the school disclosures, I decided to see Lelina. We conversed over an hour about the schools in her charge, about education in general, the problem of defective children and their treatment. She made light of the abuses in her schools, claiming that the young comrades had exaggerated the defects. At any rate, she added, the guilty had already been removed from the schools. Similarly to many other responsible communists, Lelina was consecrated to her work and gave all her time and energies to it. Naturally, she could not personally oversee everything. The show schools, being the most important in her estimation, she devoted most of her time to them. The other schools were left in the care of her numerous assistants, whose fitness for the work was judged largely according to their political usefulness. Our talk strengthened my conviction that I could have no part in the work of the Bolshevik Board of Education. The Board of Health offered as little opportunity for real service that should not discriminate in favor of show hospitals or the political views of the patients. This principle of discrimination prevailed, unfortunately, even in the sick rooms. Like all communist institutions, the Board of Health was headed by a political commissar, Dr. Pervukin. He was anxious to secure my assistance, proposing to put me in charge of factory, dispensary, or district nursing, a very flattering and tempting offer, and one that appealed to me strongly. I had several conferences with Dr. Pervukin, but they led to no practical result. Whenever I visited his department, I found groups of men and women waiting, endlessly waiting. They were doctors and nurses, members of the intelligentsia, none of them communists, who were employed in various medical branches, but their time and energies were being wasted in the waiting rooms of Dr. Pervukin, the political commissar. They were a sorry lot, dispirited and dejected, those men and women, once the flower of Russia. Was I to join this tragic procession? Submit to the political yoke? Not until I should become convinced that the yoke was indispensable to the revolutionary process would I consent to it. I felt that I must first secure work of a non-partisan character, work that would enable me to study conditions in Russia and get into direct touch with the people, the workers, and peasants. Only then should I be able to find my way out of the chaos of doubt and mental anguish that I had fallen prey to.
This concludes today's reading of My Disillusionment in Russia, by Emma Goldman. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.